Welcome to Storefront History 30. We're entering Unit 1, Outcome 1. And before we get too deep into Outcome 1 and talking about the different cultures at contact or first contact here in what we can now call Canada, I think we need to just go through some definitions on what worldviews are and what the ideas behind this idea of differing cultures colliding. The important thing we need to understand with this, and this is just going to be more definitions and ideas, is we're still feeling the effects of what happened 400 years ago today, and sort of the results of and the effects of two differing groups colliding in this huge event, which now we know had worldwide effects. So let's just take an idea, and let's first look at what this idea of worldview is. So what I want you guys to do is when I'm sort of done talking here and explaining this, just pause for a minute or two, and if you want, you can write it down, and you don't have to. But I just want you to use this picture and answer sort of two questions. And the first is I want you to come up with an idea of what you think worldview is based on this picture. And then I want you to take a look at what do you think using this picture is causing these people to have a differing worldview. So you know what, if you want, you can pause it right now. All right, so now you're back, you've unpaused it. You've come up with your definition of what a worldview is and what causes this worldview. So hopefully you got this idea of things like, difference of opinion or how people are seeing the world or things like that. And we'll get a little bit more formal in regards to what our definition is. But I guess looking at this picture, hopefully you came up with this idea that in this picture, it's the environment that causes a differing worldview. So you see a guy right here, right at the front of the elephant. I don't know if that's the safest place to stand, but his environment is only focusing on the tusk of the elephant, and his idea is that what he thinks is it's a spear. The guy sitting on the ladder here, all he can feel is just a giant mass in front of him. He can't see anything. Obviously, he's blindfolded. I don't know how he got the ladder there, but that's besides the point. But the idea here is to him, it's a wall. Now, I don't know why this elephant's not moving, especially when a guy's grabbing his tail. But the guy at the back, right, his worldview is, and based on his environment, is he just has a hand on the tail. And if he knows no different, if he doesn't know what an elephant is, well, to him, it's a rope. Let's take this a little bit further and sort of get this idea of what worldview is. So when we look at a worldview, or what worldview is we need to sort of understand that it's a way that a group of people, or could be one individual, is going to determine or explain their environment or their way of life. What we usually see is connections to religion, and that's what religion's used for. It's definitely used for faith, but it's also used to determine things like right and wrong, why are we here, good and bad, etc. And we start to see connections to political organizations of these groups because, again, how they determine what's right or wrong or who has power is going to tie to how they organize and how they run and how they regulate those things within their groups. So what happens when two groups or more with different worldviews come across each other for the first time? And that's sort of our million-dollar question here. Well, if we use past examples, and we can use present-day events also, there are typically three potential outcomes that happen. And these potential outcomes are accommodation, assimilation, and then finally annihilation. Now, before we go into these in more detail, we just need to look at what happens when groups meet, or we need to understand who these groups are or who these groups are that are meeting. So when we see two cultures meet, we can usually label one as the dominant group. Now, what makes this group more dominant? Well, typically what we see is a further advancement in technologies. So we're talking things like weapons, right? Who controls the guns, and that's going to be a big one. Transportation, could be shelters, could be medicines, it could be a ton of other things, but this idea of further advanced technologies or further along technologies usually shows dominance. One that we may not think or we may take for granted is this idea of education. And when we look at education, for the most part, it's just the ability to read and write. Now, we sort of view that as education, but in the past, when there was no education, it was just, who's literate and who's not literate. What this allows groups to do is control information, right? If you can't read it, you don't know what it says, but the group that can interpret it whatever way they want, right? And we see a lot of that, during medieval times, with kings and queens and even the church sort of saying this is right and this is wrong and controlling people that way. And finally, one other way, and there's more than this, but these are just three ways that we've considered more people dominant, is this access to wealth. And wealth can be land, who controls the land, because land has resources, and resources equals money at the end of the day, or who has money, right? And what can money buy? Now, this is always about power. And this idea that those with power can control those without power. So usually the dominant group is a group with power, and the inferior group usually has no power. Or they do have power, but it's just not strong enough, or the dominant group kind of can take that power away, right? And this changes, right? And we're going to take a look at sort of how this power shift here in Canada, when it first came here was actually pretty even, right? Now you can probably make arguments that the First Nations groups had more power when Europeans first came here. But as Europeans came over more and started bringing more of their resources and started creating dependency, we see a huge shift, right? From who's the dominant group and then who's the inferior group. So let's just take a look at this idea of accommodation. And we need to understand that accommodation is our ideal outcome. What happens is, we can take a look at our circles on the bottom here. We have a blue circle plus a red circle, and we get an even larger purple circle. So the idea here is culture one is blue, and let's say that's the dominant culture or the perceived dominant culture. And we add in culture red, the non-dominant culture, the inferior culture. And the idea here is both groups want to coexist together, right? And they want to form a larger group, and they want to share resources and ideas and keep cultures and understand that both have equal say and both are very important in living together. So accommodation is our ideal outcome. That's what we want. The second outcome is assimilation. Now, this isn't the worst possible outcome, but it always benefits the dominant culture. When we look at assimilation, what I want you guys to kind of picture in your head is this idea of absorption. So it's the idea of the inferior culture being absorbed into the dominant culture. What we typically see is the inferior group loses their history, loses their culture, loses their way of life. A lot of terms you'll hear nowadays with a lot of groups is this idea of cultural genocide, right? That when you lose your culture, you lose yourself. So if we were to take our colors again, blue being dominant, red being inferior, is we see a larger group, a larger circle on the right, but the circle's blue. So basically we've taken the dominant culture blue and added in the dominant culture red, but we've ended up with blue. So again, we see that this benefits the dominant culture. Finally, we see this idea of annihilation. And this is the worst possible outcome, especially for the inferior group. And this has happened quite a bit in history, and you guys will have an opportunity to look that up in a second here. But what we see is the dominant group gets rid of the inferior group, and this can happen in a number of ways. It can be based on diseases spread. It can be based on the group just basically destroying the other group and there's no more left of them. But what we see is, there may be some landmarks that are left and things like that, but there is no history, there is no culture left over. All we see is the dominant group. So all we've really switched up here, and maybe to make this different than this assimilation, is we go dominant culture, but we're minusing the inferior culture because they're getting rid of them. We don't see an increase in population or an increase of both on the far right here because all that's left is the dominant culture. Right? So worst possible outcome is annihilation, especially for those in the inferior group. And so what this will lead to is your assignment. And this isn't a hard assignment, and really should only take you 15 or so minutes to do, but I really want you to understand these three concepts: accommodation, assimilation, and annihilation, because we will be using these especially in this first outcome as we talk about these two groups meeting, and it will definitely tie to your three assignments below, understanding these things as these two cultures meet. So what I want you to do is use the Google machine, whether it be your phones or your computer, and I want you to find one specific example for each from any point in world history. So it could be Canadian history if you'd like, it could be European history, it could be Asian history, it doesn't matter when, I don't care about the time frame, but I do want specific examples. So get specific cultures. Dates and stuff don't matter so much, but tell me who the cultures are that this event happened to, and maybe even throw in why or what happened. It doesn't need to be long, a couple sentences for each, and I'm 100% fine with that. So if you click on the right of the Weebly, you'll actually have a sheet on there, and it's hopefully the sheet that you're going through with this little video, and that can kind of guide the way you want to do the assignment. When you've completed it, you can either hand it in to me physically in class, or just use the box beside the assignment here to hand it in. You can attach it right to it, and it'll come to my email, and I can correct it and give it back to you. So good luck. If you have any questions, my contact information is on the Weebly, and I can see what I can do to walk you through. Good luck again, and we'll see you in the future. All right, bye-bye.